Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Ramting Zhou from the Department of Communication of Science and Technology, the University of Science and Technology of China. So I'm be honored to be preside over this session. I'm also very proud of to say that more nearly 30 of my USTC colleagues, students, and alumni are here with us today. And I'm excited to let you know that tomorrow we will be holding the USTC Symposium on Science and Technology Communication and PCST Roundtable Conference in Hefei. So some of us will move to Hefei this evening. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jennifer Metcalfe. Ms. Metcalfe has an outstanding reputation in our field as she is the former president of PCST. Today, she will be sharing with us her thoughts on the value of science communication for members, masses, and minorities. Let's give a warm welcome to Ms. Metcalfe.
Ni hao, shay shay, and bingeling. They are the three Chinese words I know. Oh, gambei. I forgot gambei. Bingeling was a word that means ice cream that I learnt when cycling from Qingdao to Beijing with my colleague Michelle Redlinger in 2005 after the symposium, PCST Symposium in Beijing. And we had a wonderful time on that cycle trip, and it's lovely to be back in China. I've actually had quite a long history of connection with China, starting with my first visit in 2001, when I presented a survey on how journalists in Australia use the internet, which was relatively new back then. Since that time, of course, there's been lots of changes. Yesterday, Donghong Cheng mentioned the first symposium that we had in 2005 when I had my bingeling cycle trip of over 1,000 kilometres. After that, we produced 2 books with my colleagues Donghong Cheng, Bernard Schiller, Michael Claessens, Tos Gascoigne, and Professor Shi Shunqi, who is not here today. At the Human Scale, International Practices in Science Communication and Communicating Science in the Social Context. In 2010, I presented about the theoretical and practical science communication happening in Australia. In 2012, I talked about an audit that happened in Australia. In 2021, I was briefly a guest professor at Suzhou University Science Communication Research Centre and presented a video for the opening of their centre. And last year, I was lucky enough to be in Suzhou again, and also Shanghai, where I presented 2 talks. One on taking a more reflexive view of science communication and one on the evolution of PCST. And I'm taking this idea of reflexive science communication further in today's talk. And it reflects my thinking since 35 years ago, which is when PCST also started, and I started my journey as a science communicator. And 30 years ago, I attended my first conference in Montreal. Almost exactly 29 years ago, I started Econet Communication in Australia, as the first science communication agency, private agency in Australia, perhaps the world, who knows. I started my career as a PhD student late in life, 13 years ago, almost exactly, and it took me quite a while to do it, and 5 years ago, almost exactly, I graduated from my PhD. And my reflections today talk about what's changed over that time, how my thinking has changed and coalesced over that period of time. In this picture, which was taken about 2 weeks ago, I was in Saudi Arabia on a project there, which is very exciting, and I'm showing some teachers of elementary school there how to make an aquifer in a jar, because groundwater is very important in this country, and understanding how water comes and how we should conserve it is important. But what is a science communicator, and what value do we bring to society? This is generally how science communication has been perceived, that there is a consensus of scientific facts which the science communicator then tries to convey and combat any misinformation and disinformation that might happen, and public trust and acceptance occurs. The public are then assumed to act positively, and then public good is seen to happen as a result. However, there are a number of assumptions with this model. The first one is that achieving scientific consensus is the basis of gaining public trust. The second assumption is that conveying facts accurately will lead to public trust in science. That overcoming misinformation and disinformation is essential for building public trust. That gaining public trust will actually lead to positive actions and decisions. And that achieving public good is an outcome of gaining trust in consensus science. And all of this is depending on the big assumption that all science is good. And I would question all of those assumptions, including the assumption that the science communicator's primary role are to convey consensus science and gain trust in science, which to my mind is the promotion of science. Well, who are science communicators? They are scientists, they are journalists, they are professionals like myself, and they are also alternative science communicators, activists, leading farmers, leaders in community who have taken on a role to learn about science and to communicate it. I want to introduce more this idea of the reflexive science communicator, which has, I've got down there 7 features of a reflexive science communicator. The first one is about self-reflection, and that is understanding your own attitudes, values and assumptions that you bring to the science communication process. The second one, which is something that I've really carried throughout my science communication career, and that is the importance of understanding the cultural, social and economic context in which we are operating at a particular point in time. I think, and this is something that's been a newer understanding, is the importance of identifying and respecting other forms of knowledge. I think the most important skill for a science communicator is the skill of active listening, and that is to understand the perceptions, concerns and needs of the other actors involved in the science communication process. I think we still have a role to design clear messages that makes scientific uncertainty clear. We have a role to mediate collaborative interactions between the various actors, and that is what I'm going to focus on today in my talk, is that role of a cultural mediator. But we also have a role to engage in continual reflection and learning throughout our science communication practice. So the 3 things I'm talking about are the masses, often referred to as the general public. Minority groups. Here I'm talking about special interest groups. They could be communities, like I'm working with in Saudi Arabia, which are the small communities and villages that live in or near the nature reserves. They could be communities of interest, like farmers, of a particular type, for example. So it covers particularly concerned groups of interest. And then the members, those of us working within the scientific community. So turning first of all to members, I think a reflexive science communicator understands the method of research that has taken place. They try to understand the assumptions that happen in that method of research and the level of scientific uncertainty, and there is always scientific uncertainty, as well as the disagreements that take place. Looking back to COVID as an example, there was a lot of hype about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as treatments for COVID and recovery from it. And here are two quotes from the then President Trump about it being a potential use. As a result of media and political hype, there was a lot of stockpiling and buying up of these drugs. But it wasn't just the media and political leaders who were promoting this as a potential solution. For example, there were preclinical trials which showed the drugs had antiviral properties against the virus. These drugs had been used in the past against malaria and autoimmune diseases. Small-scale studies in China and France suggested that it did have benefits, including faster viral clearance. It was only later, when there was time for larger randomised trials, that we found out that, in fact, it didn't have any effect in reducing mortality or severe outcomes. And this is where communicators can play a role in helping to, first of all, this is just two ways, designing transparent messages. And when I'm designing messages, I always take a risk communication approach, which has essentially three questions. What do you want to get across to this specific audience? What do they want to know about this topic? And what, importantly, could they get wrong unless you stress the correct information, which is about the level of certainty and uncertainty in this example. I also think media and social media training has an important role in building the capacity of scientists and researchers so that they can understand how the media operates, how to convey clear messages through the media and social media, and how to use the methods of the media and the social media to get their messages across, because members are not going to change how the media and social media operate. But training can help you to deal with it. Let's turn to minority groups. I mentioned this project in Saudi Arabia. Our role was to increase the awareness and understanding of communities that live in or near 6 new nature reserves, about the benefits of the new nature reserves and the importance of protecting biodiversity in their area. Before developing a project and a program to do this, we did a lot of community consultation. And in this photo, you can see that I'm in a hall with about 40 angry men who are angry because they have been stopped from grazing in the lands that they normally graze their camel, sheep and goats. They're angry because the wolves are coming down to take their sheep and goats. And my role is just to listen to them. So they were yelling at me in a language I did not understand. I had an interpreter behind me telling me what they were saying. But it was an important role to listen to what it was that they had to say. And we went around to about 15 villages to listen. And we found out about the community's values and identities. We found out that they have a very strong connection to their land and their animal herds, even though they don't need necessarily in Saudi to have cattle for their livelihoods like other countries I've worked in. It's a very strong part of their culture and their connection. They have a very strong concern about youth and job opportunities. That's really important for them, and they want their children to have jobs in the nature reserves and in the tourism that is increasing in the region. Despite all of this angst, they have a very deep respect for authority and a very strong connection, of course, with Islam, which includes some very powerful tenets of environmental protection. They want to embrace the modern society but still retain their cultural identity and practices. And understanding these things enabled us to develop a community engagement and environmental literacy program. In the picture on your left-hand side, you can see that one of our team is interviewing a scientist involved in reintroducing animals back into the nature reserves, animals like oryx, ibex, sand gazelles, and eventually the Arabian leopard. And he is interviewing him with the questions that we found out from the community. And then in the room are 30 nature champions that we recruited from the villages that we visited. 15 men and 15 women. And they are also asking questions of the scientists and learning more about them. So there's not a straight presentation there, you can see. There's a dialogue, a conversation. Likewise, in the other picture, we were out at the nursery where they're growing native plants to restore overgrazed areas and also to make the townships more beautiful with landscaping with native plants. And here you can see some of the nature champions talking to the manager of the nursery about what they're doing in this room. So they are learning and engaging with each other. So we saw our role as science communicators very much as mediating, about sharing different knowledge, about encouraging dialogue, and very importantly about providing opportunities for relationships of trust. And so we encourage very much this dialogue, this interaction between these people. Let's turn to the third group, the masses, the general public. But they have different values, identities and knowledges. They have different histories and relationships with scientific institutions, with government departments. There's a very strong power of the social media with the masses and therefore mis and disinformation. And this is another example, which is about the COVID-19 vaccines in Uganda. And Ugandan people weren't so concerned about taking vaccines, they were concerned about what other governments were doing with them. And the vaccine of AstraZeneca, which is what I was vaccinated with for my first 3 vaccinations, was being dumped in these countries as it was seen to have some potential side effects. And in some countries like the UK and Australia, they were saying that it shouldn't be used by people under 25. Well, that's not me, so I was okay. But so that was causing concern, and understanding that concern could help drive better communication. Likewise, in West Africa with the Ebola epidemic, a lot of the policymakers and researchers were concerned about the misinformation that was happening, about people not having the right knowledge and understanding that was there. But when anthropologists went in and researched this, they found that it was a very confusing information environment with information coming from all different sorts of sources, and that the population did not have good historical relationships with the health authorities or health institutions. And all of those things were affecting the communication. So again, a reflexive science communicator would be able to understand and explain the various contexts. They would be able to tailor it to different segments, design those messages that I talked about before that are transparent in their dealings with the population. I'd like to turn to China, where there's very many mass organisations. And I read through recently the chapter in the Communicating Science book that came out in 2020, a chapter written by Yin Ling and Li Honglin. And in this chapter, it talks about a meeting of 4 prestigious organisations that happened in May 2016, where the Chinese leaders put forward the statement that science popularisation should be attached the same importance as that of science and technology innovation. The authors then went on to explain that to achieve this economic transformation, they acknowledged that it will not only depend on the driving force of science and technology innovation, but also on the understanding, support and participation from the public in the process of the innovation. Now, last week at the Science to You conference, or earlier this week, we heard about the I'm going to say this wrong, Zhejiang's green program in the rural areas. This is a program where there was grassroots involvement as well as government involvement, local government involvement in greening a whole area. And this article was in the People's Daily Online site, and it talks about the village of Pushan, where tourists are joining in a bamboo dance with the villagers in a place that used to be covered with illegal buildings and stinky trash dumps. So over 2 decades, the community and leaders worked together to clean up the river, to clean up the other places that were nearby the river. This is a place next to the river, which has been made into a fitness park for locals to use. So that connection between land and river shows signs of reflexive science communication happening. In that same book that I mentioned before is a chapter in the UK, and Melanie Smallman has a quote in that chapter that says, "The role of the science communicator has potentially shifted from one who explains science to the public to one who helps scientists and technology developers understand society." I think it's not so much a shift, it's an addition. I think we still explain science to the public, but we have an even more important role, and that is to help scientists and those involved in research to understand society, to become reflexive communicators, to be part of the whole situation. In the last few weeks, I have been with a couple of colleagues, Fabian Medvecki and Michelle Redlinger, and we've been playing with a few words like epistemic butinage and bricolage and assemblage. And in thinking about that last one of assemblage, I've been thinking it's a nice metaphor for what science communication can be. These are 3 French words. And so I put my thinking into ChatGPT to come up with a picture of what science communication assemblage might look like. And it's where we are using all the different factors, disciplines, tools, methods, interacting dynamically and evolving in a flexible way as we move forward into the future. It's an exciting time for science communication.